The ballroom went dead silent. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped mid-air. A ruthless syndicate leader, a man who could end a bloodline with a single nod, had just grabbed the curvy plus-size accountant everyone was ruthlessly mocking and pulled her directly onto his lap. The reason it wasn't just unbridled desire. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria in New York City was a sea of calculated perfection. Beneath the cascading light of Swarovski crystal chandeliers, the elite of both the corporate world and the criminal underworld mingled. The air was thick with the scent of Tom Ford, cologne, vintage Dom Perignon, 2008 and dangerous secrets. Standing near a massive marble pillar, desperately trying to blend into the shadows, was Penelope Hayes. Penelope Penny, to the few people who actually knew her, didn't belong here. In a room full of size zero socialites, poured into restrictive silk slips, and men wearing bespoke Brioni suits, Penny was conspicuously unapologetically fat. She was a size 18, her lush, heavy curves draped in a custom deep emerald velvet gown designed by Christian Siriano. The dress hugged her wide hips and full bust falling elegantly to the floor, but no amount of high fashion could shield her from the piercing, judgmental stares of the Manhattan elite. She wasn't a mobster's daughter, nor was she a high society trophy wife. Penny was a senior forensic auditor for Kroll Inc., one of the most elite corporate investigation and risk consulting firms in the world. For the past 6 months, she had been buried in offshore accounts, shell companies and encrypted ledgers tracking a missing $50 million. The money belonged to the Costa family, a notorious old money syndicate that controlled the eastern seaboard's shipping ports, and the head of that family, Lorenzo Costa, was currently holding court across the room. Lorenzo was a terrifyingly handsome man, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating an aura of lethal stillness. He sat in a high-backed velvet wing chair, surrounded by his lieutenants. His dark eyes scanned the room with the detached boredom of an apex predator. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo, a platinum Rolex Daytona glinting on his wrist. Penny took a nervous sip of her sparkling water, her fingers trembling slightly. She had the flash drive in her sequined clutch. It contained the routing numbers from a Cayman Islands bank, proving exactly who within Lorenzo's inner circle was siphoning his funds. She just needed a moment alone with him. But getting to Lorenzo meant navigating the sharks circling the perimeter. Well, look what the tide dragged into the VIP section. The voice was high-sharp and dripping with venom. Penny braced herself, turning slowly to face Bianca Montgomery. Bianca was the daughter of a prominent state senator, a woman whose skeletal frame was adorned in a barely-there silver Prada gown. She was widely known to be vying for the position of Lorenzo Costa's wife, treating the Mafia Boss as the ultimate designer accessory. Bianca looked Penny up and down, her perfectly glossed lips twisting into a sneer of pure disgust. Behind her stood 2 equally emaciated cronies, snickering behind their champagne flutes. "I think you're lost, sweetheart," Bianca said loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the jazz quartet playing in the corner. "The kitchen is through the double doors in the back. Or did you already eat everything on the catering carts?" A few heads turned. The cruel laughter rippled through the immediate vicinity. Penny felt the familiar hot sting of humiliation prick at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to look down. She had fought her whole life to take up space in rooms that wanted her invisible. She squared her shoulders, her emerald gown catching the light. "I'm here on business," Ms. Montgomery Penny said, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "If you'll excuse me." She tried to step around the socialite, but Bianca sidestepped, blocking her path. The senator's daughter leaned in her eyes, glinting with malice. "Business." What kind of business does a woman like you have with Lorenzo Costa? Bianca laughed a harsh, grating sound. Look at you. You're taking up the space of 3 women. You're sweating through your velvet, and you smell like anxiety. A man like Lorenzo doesn't even see women like you. You're invisible. No worse. You're a joke. The crowd around them had grown quiet, eager for the blood sport. Men in expensive suits watched with amused detachment. Women hid their cruel smiles behind their glasses. Penny's grip on her clutch tightened until her knuckles turned white. The heavy flash drive pressed against her palm through the satin fabric. She needed to deliver the data. She couldn't afford to break down crying in the middle of the Waldorf Astoria. "I suggest you step aside," Bianca Penny said, her tone dropping a subtle warning edging into her voice. Or what Bianca mocked, taking a step closer, intentionally tipping her glass so a few drops of red wine splashed onto the hem of Penny's emerald gown. "You'll sit on me. Go home. You're embarrassing yourself. This is a room for thoroughbreds, not cattle." The surrounding guests gasped softly at the sheer audacity of the insult. Penny froze. The utter cruelty of the words paralyzed her. For a split second, she was a chubby teenager, again being mocked in the locker room. The crushing weight of the room's collective judgment bore down on her. Then the ambient noise in the ballroom simply ceased. The jazz quartet faltered and stopped playing. The low hum of conversation evaporated. The heavy, oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of measured, deliberate footsteps against the marble floor. The crowd parted instantly, backing away as if repelled by a magnetic force. Lorenzo Costa was walking toward them. Lorenzo moved with a terrifying grace, his expression carved from stone. His dark eyes were locked entirely on Penny. He didn't even glance at Bianca or the other whispering guests. Behind him walked Matteo, his fiercely loyal underboss, who subtly motioned for the perimeter guards to close in. Bianca's sneer instantly morphed into a radiant, desperate smile. She smoothed her silver dress and stepped forward, completely obstructing Penny. "Lorenzo, darling." Bianca purred, reaching out to touch his arm. "I was just dealing with a bit of a pest. Security really needs to do a better job at the door. I don't know how this creature slipped past them." Lorenzo didn't break his stride. He didn't even acknowledge Bianca's hand on his sleeve. He simply kept walking his broad chest, catching Bianca's shoulder and shoving her aside with the effortless dismissal of a man moving a nuisance out of his path. Bianca stumbled her stilettos, catching on the marble, gasping in shock as she nearly dropped her wine. Lorenzo stepped right up to Penny. Penny's breath hitched. Up close, the sheer size of the Mafia Boss was overwhelming. He was a foot taller than her, smelling of dark tobacco cedar and an underlying scent of pure danger. His eyes, dark and fathomless, roved over her face, taking in the flush of humiliation on her cheeks, the slight tremble of her full lips, and the proud, defiant set of her jaw. A heavy, velvet wingback chair had been dragged near the pillar earlier by one of his men. Lorenzo turned smoothly, unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket, and sat down in the chair. He looked up at Penny. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. The tension in the room was a physical weight. Then Lorenzo reached out, his large, calloused hand wrapped securely around Penny's thick wrist. It wasn't a painful grip, but it was absolute. With one smooth, powerful pull, he yanked her forward. Penny let out a startled, breathless squeak as her balance shifted. Before she could process the movement, she was falling. She landed heavily, her soft, generous curves crashing directly onto Lorenzo Costa's lap. The ballroom erupted into a collective, silent shock. Men lowered their glasses, their jaws slack. Bianca dropped her wineglass entirely, the crystal shattering loudly against the floor, splattering dark red across the white marble. Penny's heart hammered violently against her ribs. She was sitting sideways across the thighs of the most dangerous man in New York. The contrast between them was staggering. She was entirely soft, thick thighs, a full stomach pressed against his rigid torso, heavy breasts rising and falling with her panicked breathing. He was entirely hard muscles, like coiled steel beneath the fine Italian wool of his suit, unyielding and perfectly composed. She scrambled to get up her face, burning with the heat of 1,000 suns. "Mr. Costa, I am so sorry." She stammered. Terrified she was crushing him, terrified of the spectacle. Lorenzo's arm wrapped around her thick waist, a heavy, warm band of possessive iron that anchored her firmly in place. He pulled her flush against his chest, his fingers splaying wide across the curve of her hip. "Sit still, Penelope," he commanded, his voice, a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through his chest and directly into her spine. He didn't look strained. He didn't look disgusted. He held her weight effortlessly, as if she were made of nothing but air. He looked up at the frozen crowd, his eyes eventually landing on a pale, trembling Bianca. "Bianca." Lorenzo said, his voice deadly quiet, yet it carried across the dead silent room like a gunshot. "You seem to be under the mistaken impression that you dictate who belongs in my presence." "Lorenzo, I was only trying to—" Bianca stuttered, her previous bravado entirely shattered under his lethal stare. "Penelope is my personal guest." Lorenzo continued, his thumb absent-mindedly stroking the velvet fabric at Penny's hip, a deeply intimate gesture that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "She takes up exactly as much space as I want her to. And if anyone in this room ever disrespects her again, they won't just be escorted out. They will disappear. Am I understood?" The threat wasn't an exaggeration. It was a terrifying real-life promise. Bianca nodded frantically, tears of humiliation spilling over her heavily mascaraed eyelashes, before she turned and practically fled the ballroom. The crowd immediately looked away, suddenly intensely interested in their shoes, the ceiling, their drinks, anything to avoid eye contact with the syndicate leader. The jazz quartet, realizing they needed to diffuse the silence, hastily resumed playing. Penny sat frozen on his lap, her mind spinning wildly. He had defended her. He had claimed her as his guest, in front of the entire New York underworld. But the romantic illusion shattered a second later, when Lorenzo leaned his head down, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just beneath her ear. "Did you bring the data from Kroll?" he whispered, his breath hot against her neck. Penny stiffened. The lap pull wasn't just a defense of her honor. It was a tactical maneuver. It established her as his property, in the eyes of his men, making her untouchable, while allowing them to communicate without the bugs and spies lurking in the crowd. "Yes," she whispered back, leaning her weight fully against his chest to maintain the illusion of intimacy. She reached into a clutch, her trembling fingers wrapping around the small metal flash drive. "It's all here. The offshore routing numbers, the Cayman accounts, and the mole," he murmured, his lips grazing her earlobe, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Did you find out who authorized the wire transfers?" Penny swallowed hard. She slowly slipped her hand down, sliding the flash drive into the breast pocket of his tuxedo. As she did, she turned her head slightly, their faces now mere inches apart. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the ruthless intelligence behind his dark eyes. "It's Matteo," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "Your underboss. He's been funneling the money through a shell company in Delaware for 6 months. Lorenzo didn't flinch. His expression didn't change, but Penny felt the muscles in his thighs and chest lock into solid stone beneath her. The arm around her waist tightened incrementally. "Are you absolutely certain, Penelope?" he asked softly, though the underlying tone was lethal. "Because if you are wrong, I cannot protect you from what happens next." "I don't make mistakes in my ledgers, Mr. Costa," Penny said, a spark of her professional arrogance cutting through her physical intimidation. "The numbers don't lie. Matteo is bleeding you dry." Lorenzo stared into her eyes for a long moment. He was a man who lived a life of constant betrayal and violence, yet looking at the soft, brilliant woman currently sitting on his lap, a strange, dark fascination flickered in his gaze. "Good girl," he whispered, his hand sliding up from her hip to rest possessively against the curve of her waist. But as Lorenzo finally looked up, his eyes meeting Matteo's across the room, Penny realized the real danger hadn't even begun. Matteo was watching them intently, his hand resting subtly inside his jacket, right where a shoulder holster would be. And Matteo had just realized that the fat, invisible accountant he had dismissed as a nobody had just handed his death warrant to the boss. The jazz quartet played a frantic, breathless rendition of a Cole Porter classic, utterly oblivious to the silent, lethal communication passing between the men in the room. Lorenzo Costa did not break eye contact with Matteo. The underboss stood near the extravagant ice sculpture, his face a mask of casual indifference, but his right hand remained terrifyingly still inside his tailored suit jacket. Penny could feel the violent acceleration of Lorenzo's heartbeat against her shoulder. The raw, animalistic tension radiating from his massive frame told her everything her spreadsheets could not. They were trapped. "Mr. Costa," Penny whispered, her voice trembling as she felt the heavy reality of the criminal underworld crashing into her corporate, predictable life. "He knows. Matteo is calculating the perimeter." "I know Mia Cara," Lorenzo murmured, his tone startlingly gentle despite the deadly circumstances. His large hand slid from her waist, gripping her soft, thick upper arm with reassuring firmness. "When I stand, you stay exactly behind me. You do not look at him. You do not stop moving." "Do you understand?" Penny nodded frantically, her emerald velvet gown rustling. Lorenzo stood up in one fluid, powerful motion, bringing Penny up with him. He kept her tucked securely behind his broad shoulder, effectively shielding her generous curves from Matteo's line of sight. To the rest of the ballroom, it looked as though the syndicate boss was simply escorting his new, unconventional conquest to a more private location. But to the trained killers in the room, the subtle shift in Lorenzo's stance was a declaration of war. Lorenzo caught the eye of Dominic, his hulking head of security, who stood by the private elevators. Dominic didn't need a verbal command. He tapped the earpiece hidden beneath his dark hair, and instantly 4 men in identical black suits seamlessly detached themselves from the crowd, forming a loose protective diamond formation around Lorenzo and Penny. "We are leaving," Lorenzo commanded softly. They moved toward the exit, their pace measured but urgent. Penny struggled to keep up in her heels, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt heavy, clumsy, and entirely out of place in this deadly choreography. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, praying that her Crow Linkut's training in corporate espionage would somehow translate to surviving a mafia hit. "Leaving so soon, boss?" The voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Matteo had moved with terrifying speed, intercepting them just feet from the grand mahogany doors leading to the lobby. He stood blocking their path, a polite, venomous smile painted on his handsome face. 2 of Matteo's own loyalists flanked him, their hands hovering near their waistbands. "The atmosphere has grown stale, Matteo," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with absolute chilling authority. "And my guest is tired." Matteo's eyes darted to Penny. The contempt in his gaze was palpable, stripping away the glamorous facade of the Waldorf Astoria. "A Kroll auditor," Lorenzo Reale. I thought your tastes ran a little more refined. She seems like a heavy burden to carry, especially when she's poking her nose into Credit Suisse portfolios and Palantir data streams where she doesn't belong. Penny gasped quietly. Matteo knew exactly how she had tracked the money. He knew about the Palantir data modeling software she had utilized to crack the encrypted ledgers. The only burden I carry is the weight of incompetence within my own ranks, Lorenzo countered smoothly, taking a deliberate step forward. His sheer size dwarfed Matteo, but the underboss did not flinch. Step aside. I don't think I will, Matteo whispered, dropping the facade entirely. $50 million, Lorenzo. You have enough. The families are tired of your strict rules. They want growth. I was just facilitating a necessary transition. By stealing from my bloodline, Lorenzo stated, his eyes dead and cold. Matteo's hand twitched inside his jacket. It's nothing personal. It's just accounting. Before Matteo could draw his weapon, Lorenzo moved. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, with a speed that defied his massive frame, Lorenzo lunged forward, his fist connecting with Matteo's throat with the sickening crunch of collapsing cartilage. At the exact same moment, Dominic and the Loyalist guards drew their suppressed weapons. Pat! 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 The muffled rhythmic sounds of gunfire echoed over the jazz music. Chaos erupted. Women screamed their designer gowns, tearing as they scrambled for cover beneath the banquet tables. Crystal champagne towers crashed to the marble floor in a glittering explosive wave of glass and expensive alcohol. Lorenzo spun, wrapping both of his massive arms around Penny's waist and tackling her to the floor as a bullet shattered the mahogany doorframe, right where her head had been a millisecond prior. They crashed onto the cold marble, Lorenzo twisting in midair so that his large, heavily muscled back took the brunt of the impact, cradling Penny tightly against his chest. Penny sobbed in pure terror, her face buried in the lapel of his midnight blue tuxedo. She could smell the gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood mixing with his Tom Ford cologne. "Stay down!" Lorenzo roared over the screams of the elite. He rolled, pulling Penny with him, behind a massive, overturned catering table. "I can't run fast enough, Lorenzo," Penny cried, hyperventilating, as she looked at her heavy thighs, utterly terrified her size would be the reason he got killed. "Leave me. I gave you the flash drive." Lorenzo grabbed her face with both hands, his thumbs aggressively wiping away her tears. His dark eyes burned with a fierce, possessive intensity that completely halted her panic. "Do not ever tell me to leave you," he snarled, his voice vibrating with raw dominance. "You are exactly the size I need you to be. You are perfect, and you are mine to protect. Now breathe. We are walking out of here right now." Dominic provided covering fire, taking down one of Matteo's remaining men. Lorenzo hauled Penny to her feet, his arm wrapped around her waist like an iron seatbelt, and together they sprinted through the shattered double doors and into the chaotic flashing lights of the Manhattan night. The armored Maybach tore through the rain-slicked streets of Tribeca, its Vive 12 engine roaring aggressively as it evaded any potential tails. Inside the soundproof dim cabin, the silence was deafening. Penny sat shivering against the plush leather seats, her emerald dress ruined, stained with champagne dirt and a few drops of blood that didn't belong to her. She hugged her arms across her full chest, feeling entirely exposed and vulnerable. Lorenzo sat beside her, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from the car's crystal decanter. He handed one to her. His knuckles were bruised, and his tuxedo jacket was torn, but he looked completely calm, like a king surveying his violently secured kingdom. "Drink," he ordered softly. "It's Macallan 25. It will help with the shock." Penny took a shaky sip. The whiskey burned brilliantly down her throat, settling the violent tremors in her stomach. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time without the lens of terror. "Why did you pull me onto your lap?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "In the ballroom, before any of the shooting started. You could have just taken the drive." Lorenzo swirled his whiskey, his dark eyes tracing the soft, heavy curve of her jawline, moving down to the deep cleavage spilling over the velvet of her ruined gown. "Because Bianca was disrespecting what belongs to me," Lorenzo said simply. "I don't belong to you," Penny replied instinctively, her corporate independence flaring up despite the circumstances. "I am a Kroll auditor. I was hired by your holding company. This was a financial transaction." Lorenzo let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver straight to her core. He set his glass down and closed the distance between them, sliding across the leather bench until his thigh pressed intimately against her thick one. "A financial transaction," he repeated, reaching out to trace the collarbone exposed by her dress. "Is that what you call it, Penelope? You think I let just anyone breach my inner circle? I've been watching you for 3 months. I watched you sit in your office at 2 a.m. eating takeout, brilliantly dismantling offshore accounts that Ivy League lawyers couldn't crack. I watched you fight for space in a world that tries to make you feel small. You are brilliant. You are ruthless in your own right. And you are incredibly beautiful." Penny's breath hitched. She was used to men looking past her or looking at her with pity or fetishized secrecy. But Lorenzo looked at her like she was the only meal he ever wanted to consume. He looked at her heavy curves, not as an obstacle but as a feast. "Matteo is dead." Lorenzo stated, his tone shifting back to business, though his hand remained possessively on her knee. "But the 50 million is already in the Cayman Shell Company. He transferred it this morning before the gala. It will take my tech team weeks to bypass the biometric locks he put on those accounts. The families will see this as weakness." Penny stopped shaking. The mention of the accounts flipped a switch in her brain. The terrified woman faded, replaced by the senior forensic auditor, who commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. She reached into her ruined clutch and pulled out her encrypted Kroll smartphone. "You think I'm just an accountant, Lorenzo?" Penny asked, a slow, confident smile spreading across her lips. Lorenzo raised an eyebrow, captivated by the sudden shift in her demeanor. "Matteo was arrogant," Penny explained, tapping rapidly on her screen. "He used a standard Delaware LLC proxy to route the funds. When I was deep in the Palantir data model yesterday, I didn't just track the money. I assumed he might try to secure it once he knew I was auditing the books." "What did you do?" Lorenzo asked, leaning in, his gaze fixed on her brilliantly illuminated face. "I hard-coded a reverse siphon algorithm into the Shell Company's root ledger." Penny said, her eyes flashing with triumphant genius. "It's a dormant script. It activates the moment an unauthorized user like Matteo's fail-safe automated system attempts to move the money out of the Cayman account. It doesn't just block the transfer." Lorenzo's eyes widened slightly in realization. "It redirects it." "Exactly," Penny confirmed, pressing the final execution command on her phone. "Matteo's death triggered his dead man's switch 10 minutes ago. His system tried to route the 50 million to a rival cartel in Mexico. My script intercepted it." She turned the phone around to face him. On the glowing screen, a progress bar hit 100%. "The $50 million has just been successfully deposited back into your personal encrypted accounts at the Bank of Geneva," Penny said proudly. "And as a bonus, my script automatically forwarded the IP addresses of Matteo's Mexican cartel associates directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI. Your enemies are currently being raided." Lorenzo Costa stared at the screen, and then he looked at the soft, heavy, incredibly brilliant woman sitting beside him. He had spent his life surrounded by assassins, politicians and sycophants, but he had never in all his years encountered a weapon as devastatingly effective as Penelope Hayes. He didn't say a word. He took the phone from her hand, tossed it onto the opposite seat, and pulled her roughly against his chest. His mouth crashed down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claiming. It was the fierce, desperate kiss of a king who had just found his queen. Penny gasped into his mouth, her hands instinctively coming up to grip the broad, heavily muscled expanse of his shoulders. Lorenzo groaned his large hands, gripping her thick waist, lifting her effortlessly so that she was straddling his lap, right there in the back of the moving Maybach. "You are a terrifying woman, Penelope." He breathed against her lips, his hand sliding up to cup her heavy breasts through the velvet. "I'm an accountant," she whispered breathlessly, her body melting into his heat, feeling desired, powerful, and utterly safe. "No." Lorenzo corrected softly, his eyes completely entirely dark with absolute obsession. "You are mine, and tomorrow the rest of the world will know exactly who handles the Costa family ledgers." The car sped into the night, leaving the chaos, the judgment, and the past far behind them. For the first time in her life, Penelope wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was sitting on the throne exactly where she belonged. Wow, what a thrilling ride. If Penny's brilliant trap and Lorenzo's fierce protection kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Do you think you could outsmart a mafia underboss like Penny did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this dramatic mafia romance with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more intense, real-life, inspired stories of power betrayal and unexpected love.